So now on to the main event. I am honored to introduce Nikki M. Taylor to all of you. Professor Taylor is a professor in the Department of History at Howard University. She specializes in 19th century African American history and is the author of 3 previous books, including Driven Toward Madness and America's First Black Socialist. Tonight she will be talking about her new book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance. In this important work of history, Professor Taylor appends the popular idea that enslaved women only participated in covert and nonviolent forms of resistance against those who have enslaved them. In her book, Professor Taylor presents many instances of enslaved women taking part in violent revolt against enslavers who have committed great injustice against them. The stories presented, which span centuries and legal contexts, demonstrate that these acts of lethal force were carefully premeditated. Publishers Weekly, in their review of the book, calls Brooding Over Bloody Revenge a cogent and reconsideration of long-held assumptions about the gendered experience of American slavery. Everyone, let us all welcome Professor Nikki Taylor.
Thank you, Bernard. And I want to thank all of you for coming. Special thanks to my Howard University family. Could you all just stand up quickly? My entire Howard family. Thank you. And it just feels really good to be in a department and university where I'm supported fully as a scholar. I also want to thank Politics and Prose. This is my first official book event, so I'm very grateful for the platform. And also specifically Ekram, who's right there, Bernard, Bruce, and my namesake, Nikki. Wave your hand, Nikki. So they're very sweet, and they try to defray my nerves, so just bear with me. Let me get some of this set. My timer, so I don't go too long. In the middle of the night, in April 1848, in Jasper County, a 14-year-old enslaved girl by the name of Cicely ran over and alerted the neighbors that something terrible had happened in the home of Dr. James Longan, to whom she was hired. 5 neighbors immediately rushed over to the property. When they entered the front gate, they found the bloodied body of Dr. Longan's wife, Anne, who was barefoot and still in her nightclothes. And I should say here, just if you're really queasy and this might not be the lecture for you. Yeah. So they followed the trails of the bloody footprints into the crudely constructed one-room home with a quilt operating as the front door. Inside, they found the doctor's body laying on a mattress. He had been decapitated and his fingers severed. They were laying on his body. The Longans had 2 children. One was dead with a crushed skull, and the other one miraculously escaped serious injury. Cicely, the enslaved girl, recounted a harrowing story of 5 home invaders and then a racial group, 3 white and 2 black. And she said they intended to rob the family. According to her, the gang of men had chased her and Anne into the front yard, but she had managed to outrun them and narrowly escaped injury and being bludgeoned herself. It seemed very believable until it didn't. Circumstantial evidence would be Cicely's undoing. Standing there in the dark of night with just a lantern lighting up the gruesome scene, neighbors noticed that she had blood on her dress, blood splatter to be specific. And they knew that if she had blood spatter on her dress, she must have been the person wielding the axe that had killed the family. Neighbors at the scene, in an effort to do the 19th century version of forensic science, ordered Cicely to put her feet in the bloody footprints. And they noticed that the size of the footprints matched hers exactly. They also noticed she was hiding a coin purse underneath her dress with more than $11. She insisted the money was hers. The other witnesses at the scene said, hey, I saw Dr. Longan with that purse a couple of days ago at the market. But for investigators investigating the crime, the purse full of money that they concluded did in fact belong to Dr. Longan seemed to be the motive for the gruesome murders. So Cicely, though, articulated an entirely different possible motive in her recounting of the events. She said that she wasn't happy with her real owners who had hired her out to Dr. Longan. In fact, she said she had been employed with him against her will. She seemed to have a history of resistance, too, inside the Longan home. Just 2 weeks before the murder, she had burned the house to the ground, causing the family a total loss. And the reason why they had no furniture and the mattress lying on the floor and no front door was all because of Cicely. So, and she told later in a confession 2 years later, she stated that she never intended to kill Mrs. Longan or the baby. They had been a collateral damage of sorts. Her real grievance, she said, was Dr. Longan. And her grievance had been grave enough that she had seen fit to decapitate him. Perhaps it could be related to a claim that she made that night that the men in the neighborhood had been having sex with her. Certainly, she hinted that her taking the money was some sort of retribution for all the abuse from the white men in the neighborhood. The person to whom Cicely had divulged these details said in court they were declined to give these details out of a desire for decency. The indecent things that Cicely divulged were rendered or considered unspeakable in Victorian era society, which means her truth was forever excluded from the court testimony and also from historical records. But what kind of justice would Cicely face as an enslaved girl in antebellum Mississippi? Well, based on the Mississippi Slave Code, an enslaved person, regardless of their age, if they merely assaulted a white person with an intent to kill, it was punishable by death. In Mississippi, even abusive, provoking, or insulting language against a white person was considered a serious offense. For capital offenses, though, enslaved people had the right to legal counsel in a trial by jury, which seems pretty fair, right? And that wasn't always the case in states further east. Before you get too hopeful about Cicely's fate, given the fact that she had a right to a jury, Mississippi state law required that half of the people in the jury pool be slave owners. Enslaved people could not testify in court in the state, although free blacks could. The caveat was that if any free black was found guilty of false testimony, their ears could both be nailed to the pillory and then cut off, and then they were to receive 39 lashes on their bare backs at the public whipping post. So clearly there were serious deterrents for free blacks to even come forward to testify in any case. Enslaved Mississippians could appeal their convictions. But just to put this in perspective, what I notice is that the newer slave states, places like Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama, all offered enslaved people the opportunity for appeals if convicted of a capital offense. To the contrary, the older slave states, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Maryland, did not offer that option until the 19th century. Some of them not until 1865, the year slavery ended. But Cicely pled not guilty at her trial and was, despite that, summarily convicted and sentenced to death on the above circumstantial evidence that I just laid out. She exercised her right to an appeal in Mississippi's High Court of Errors and Appeals and then the state Supreme Court. In her reasons for the appeal, she said the jury, or her attorney said the judge had given the jury bad instructions. And also she said he had failed to honor her request for a new trial. And she also said that the evidence didn't constitute a guilty plea. But she didn't finally admit her guilt until 2 years later after all of her appeals had failed and her conviction had been upheld. And in fact, it's in these appellate cases is how I discovered Cicely. So that's how I found out about this 14-year-old enslaved girl. So as shocking as it was, this case, Cicely is part of a healthy number of enslaved women who exercise lethal resistance in the United States. Cicely's story is a case study, much like the ones featured in my book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge. Although that story is not in my book. I had to save one for stuff like this. Although violent resistance to slavery was not preferred it wasn't African American women's preferred form of resistance, the fact that it happened at all, despite the constant surveillance and repression that they endured as enslaved people and as enslaved women, is what makes their actions remarkable. Now, let me just give you a little bit of overview about violence before I get into this. Let me not mislead any of you. Violence, especially lethal violence, was considered the prerogative of white men in the slave era. They wielded the authority to kill, mortally injure, or maim their wives, servants, employees, and even other white men. Yet none of that white on white, free on free violence could ever trump the violence that was required to maintain slavery. The violence at that time was unparalleled, incomparable, and incomprehensible in the history of human relations in the United States and beyond. Slave owners, their wives, their parents, their siblings, their children, overseers, often delivered inhumane and even merciless discipline to their enslaved people. Even within the black community, violence has always understood to be the prerogative of black men. These patriarchal ideas about who can wield violence may make some uncomfortable with this topic or this idea of women exercising lethal resistance to injustice, and even affects how we do the work as historians. People always ask, well, why is yours the first book like this? I don't know. I think we all kind of hold on to these. We're uncomfortable with the idea of women committing violence. But jettisoning these ideas provides room for us to properly analyze women who committed lethal resistance to slavery, not as monsters, but as resistors. So despite the topic of the book and the fact that it's all about women committing using lethal force, I am still stating that black women were the least violent people in slave society, okay? My motivation for the book. Many historians have long insisted, as the introduction pointed out, that enslaved women rarely chose armed, lethal, or other forms of overt resistance. Historian by the name of Nikki M, for example, emphasized that they rejected explicit or confrontational violence in favor of covert, non-confrontational, what she and others call everyday acts of resistance, which includes talking back, having a bad attitude, pretending to be sick, pretending to be pregnant, not all of those things, and even temporarily running away. In fact, Kemp expanded the definition of everyday resistance to include appropriating additional food, clothing, and luxury items like hair bows or fabrics and things like that. Despite the varied and creative ways that enslaved women practiced everyday resistance, historians have categorized it as non-threatening and less likely to undermine or challenge the social and racial order, and the way that a slave revolt would, for example. So not only has women's resistance been exclusively understood as this softer, everyday variety, but is also mischaracterized as it relates to collective and organized resistance. With the exception of Vanessa Holden's recent book and Rebecca Hawes' brilliant article, historians have categorized slave revolt as the preserve of men, leaving the impression that women rarely led or participated in these collective revolts, like, for example, Nat Turner's. And so when women are mentioned in these larger plots, they're usually relegated to the sidelines. as mere witnesses of the main event or wives of the main organizers. So these assumptions that I just laid out are the reasons that motivated me to write the book. And besides that, my favorite history book of all time is called Celia, a Slave by Milton McLaurin. And it's just like my book, but just one case instead of 7. So about the archive, it is nearly impossible, as many of you in this room know, because many of you are historians, it's nearly impossible to chart the life experience of individual enslaved women who could not read or write. Usually historians only find, and I can get an amen in the room, scraps of evidence about them, numbers, dates, possibly a name, but rarely their voices or opinions. So it can be a challenging task to write about enslaved women. The white people who own them are typically more discoverable in the historical record for obvious reasons. But the irony of this research is that these particular enslaved women are more discoverable in the archive than the white people they killed, about whom I could rarely find their full names, their ages, or any other pertinent information. So if you get the book, you'll see that I'm really struggling to recreate who the white people were that they killed. But I got all the details about these enslaved women. In other words, it is because of their lethal resistance that these particular black women's voices were recorded and preserved in the archive. So just the opposite of what is usually the case. The archival evidence in this book is hardly new. It's court records of the murder trials that have been previously used by other historians, and except for McLaurin, not in a full-throated examination. I started with existing slave execution databases. Some of you know what they are, the SB database. And he had a list, just names sometimes, just sometimes the gender, of all the people executed for revolt or violence in the slave era. Maryland also has a useful database that I also, although I didn't use that database to feature in one of these cases, is definitely something that somebody else could certainly explore. Evidence about these cases can be found in newspapers, colonial legislative papers, coroner's inquest records, which I had never even heard of before this, and they're just a treasure trove of resources. I also found stuff in the journals of the House of Burgesses, which is a lower court in the colonial era. Compensatory slave petitions also had a lot of evidence. And then the transcripts from criminal, slave, and Oyer and Terminer courts. Oyer and Terminer courts literally means hear and determine. It's an old name from England, carry over. We sometimes forget that we were the baby of England, and a lot of our laws are built on that old model. And I also found stuff in Supreme Court records and sometimes like appellate records, as I did with Cicely's case. So my book features 7 women like Cicely who used lethal force against their enslavers. It is not intended to be exhaustive. I've left that for somebody else, maybe younger eyes, okay? I do discuss dozens of additional similar cases in each chapter. I deliberately feature 7 cases that span across time and space, from colonial Massachusetts to Revolutionary era North Carolina to early American Pennsylvania and antebellum Texas. I place the 7 women who are featured in each chapter in their proper historical and legal context, and provide the reader of the snapshot of the world they lived in and the laws that they lived under. I also featured a different woman in different location in each chapter, so that was also very deliberate. But more importantly, and this, I thought I was so creative when I did this, each chapter also features a different weapon. From poison to water to fire, axes, hatchets, and even, are you sitting? A feather bed. In fact, my book proves that any mundane household instrument could be used to wage lethal resistance when in the hand of a motivated enslaved woman. And some are more effective than others. So on the effectiveness of fire, let me read you something from page 112 in the book. In the final analysis, fire is the most formidable, if not effective, weapon enslaved women wielded to resist slavery because of its capacity to destroy everything the owners valued. A successful arson leaves in its wake economic, emotional, and physical damage for the target. It had the capacity to kill people and livestock and erase homes, barns, businesses, and towns. As Reverend Stanford stated at Rose's execution, arson's potential to harm an entire family, community, or town makes it worse than murder. If victims escape with their lives and without injury, destruction of the property brought untold economic devastation. For example, in 1736, William Cox of Virginia, and listen very carefully to this, it's very juicy. William Cox of Virginia petitioned the House of Burgesses requesting financial assistance. He told the body that he had been reduced to poverty after his enslaved woman had broken into his home, critically wounded his son, burned his tobacco house, murdered his other slaves before taking her own life. Although arson was just one element of her destructive attack, his enslaved woman destroyed every bit of his financial wealth, leaving him destitute and begging for poor relief from the colony. White slave owners who watched their homes, belongings, or businesses burn lost more than just property. Intentional fire also burned a hole through their sense of safety and peace. And if enslaved women achieved nothing else but that with the fires they set, they returned to their owners the same terrorism they experienced on a daily basis. So I spent a lot of time thinking about these cases before I constructed the book, as any good historian would do. And I'm only a good historian sometimes, but I did it with this book. I try to answer a pressing and recurring question. What factors led enslaved women to this type of resistance? Of course, with so many women across different times and spaces, they articulated many reasons for why they resorted to lethal force. I found that women who murdered their enslavers didn't have a global grievance against slavery itself. And that really surprised me because I just thought that that's what it would all be about. Okay, so at least not one that they articulated. And they didn't strive to end slavery or even murder enslavers en masse or as a whole. None of the women discussed in my book killed to secure personal or collective freedom from bondage. Not one. The motivational thread that ran through most of the cases I examined is injustice. In light of that, my argument in this larger project is quite simple. Enslaved women did, in fact, resist slavery with lethal violence, and when they did, their own ideas about injustice were a central motivation. It is no surprise that injustice would be at the center of my argument because as historian Eugene Genovese, who's a big-time historian for those who don't know, declares in his seminal text, violent confrontation with injustice lay at the core of any revolt against slavery. I agree. Because protection and justice for enslaved women were elusive through traditional, moral, and legal channels, the only form available to them is, as my student says, what they seize with these hands, okay? And while Cicely's case is about more, it's just about one woman, there are more cases in the book and beyond about women who acted collectively. So at least a few case studies in this book are about the collective acts. A second intervention I make into the historiography or into the literature, I complicate the very definition of slave revolt in order to widen the lens to include more women. Rebecca Hall, in her 2010 brilliant article, Not Killing Me Softly, defines revolt, slave revolt, as any violent coordinated act of resistance that kills or attempts to kill slave owners or their agents. Her definition plus Genovese's concept of simple revolt, which is waged against unbearable exploitation or the overstepping of traditional boundaries, are useful. So I combine both of those definitions to have this bigger one, or the type of revolt I use in my book. Organized, coordinated, violent, or lethal acts of resistance that are motivated by unbearable exploitation or injustice. This definition aptly describes the actions of the women in my book. So when somebody asks you, yes, women also led slave revolts, but their revolts function differently than the ones we are familiar with, the Nat Turner types. Theirs were smaller, local plots of revenge against their own owners. Like any true feminist, interdisciplinary methods and theories inform this historical piece. So it's a history book, but it's informed by these other theories. I examine Black women's lethal resistance within a framework that I call a Black feminist practice of justice. And I call it a Black feminist practice of justice as opposed to simply a Black practice of justice, not because these enslaved women are feminists. Maybe it's because I am, I don't know. But because feminist theory, Black feminist theory, informs my approach to the work. So I'm not saying they're feminists, I'm saying that those theories inform how I approach the work. Black feminist theory is articulated by Patricia Hill Collins, prioritizes and centers Black women's voices and experiences, decolonizing the archive and the discipline. So the discipline also needs work, right? History. It deepens our understanding and appreciation for them as historical agents. Without a Black feminist framework, enslaved actions could seem impulsive, motivated by anger, irrational, disproportionate, disorganized. In other words, these women could be possibly painted with the age-old stereotype of the angry Black woman. So that's why I had to use the theory in addition to all the other reasons. So what I say in this book is that enslaved women, contrary to what we might think, were intellectuals. They had a philosophy of justice, which is starkly different from how justice was defined by their enslavers and also the local officials. And what was it? In the simplest term, it was relief from injustice. On a deeper level, it boiled down to a sense of fairness, decency, justness, humane treatment, and they articulated their theory and their philosophy. They negotiated it and renegotiated it. So a Black feminist philosophy of justice has to, in any question, be centered on those concepts and goals. Any failure to honor that basic premise is itself an act of injustice. So the most obvious act of injustice would be slavery, but there are smaller ones too, like sexual assault or denying people basic human needs like food, adequate clothing, or disrespectful name calling of mothers in front of their children. Black women's philosophy of justice was a powerful current flowing within them, I argue in the book. And their owners had no clue at all that they harbored such strong views about justice, which was a serious misstep. Justice was so important to the women in this book that they were more willing to die from it than even freedom. So those who seized their own justice in my project had very compelling and personal reasons, which they articulated, like Cicely did. In another instance, in antebellum Virginia, rural Virginia, 60-year-old Nellie explained why she and her kin, her daughter and her grandkids, all beat their enslaver to death. He was a hard master. He would not allow any of us to go from home, nor give us any privileges which other people's servants have. He told us we should stay at home during the Christmas holidays and work. Now, to the professors or teachers in the room, yeah, that's a big injustice, right? Nellie also complained that they were not given meat. And is possibly, in this day and age, one of the last meat eaters in the room. That also is an injustice, a meatless existence. But reality was that meat was a luxury for many people, but their owner did have that luxury. Nellie and her kin righted that perceived wrong. When their quarters were searched after her owner was found dead, officials found a catalog of food that they had taken from his kitchen, including sugar, coffee, molasses, tea, 2 pieces of bacon, sausage, and spare ribs. Many of the enslaved people who used lethal violence against their owners were neither impulsive nor irrational. One of the core features that I point out in the book is that they were rational, highly organized, had a lot of forethought. They planned these murders for days, weeks, months, and even years in advance. In the course of plotting, they sometimes recruited other hands when needed. They delegated responsibilities, decided which weapon would be used, who would wield it, and they even predetermined the date and the time of the attack. And they orchestrated fairly sophisticated plans with Oscar-worthy acting to avoid suspicion or afterwards. And some even came up with complex plots to avoid or delay their executions. On the surface, it may seem to many that the women in the book exercised little restraint in how they murdered their owners. The bludgeonings that they delivered seem out of proportion to our modern sensibilities. After all, murder in exchange for cruelty doesn't seem proportionate to most of us in the room. Certainly, murdering children, which a lot of them did, seems unusually unjust to us free people living today. But enslaved women are not us, I have to remind you. For teenage Chloe, it was the cycle of the Carruthers family, the entire family's constant surveillance and reporting on her, followed by brutal beatings for the smallest thing that led her to brood over bloody revenge. In her own confession, she stated, "My motive in the first place was this. I knew that the children were compelled by my mistress," and that's the owner's wife, "to give information respecting some parts of my conduct, for which I was severely corrected, far beyond the demerit of the fault. To cut off this means of communication was my first end that I promised myself. But my second and greatest motive was to bring all the misery I possibly could upon the family, and particularly upon my mistress." Chloe critiques the disproportionality here of her mistress's violence, indicating that even enslaved women had very keen, strong ideas about proportionality when it relates to retribution. And because she had no one that she could turn to or appeal about the things that were happening to her inside the Carruthers home, she decided to rebalance the scales of justice herself. So not surprisingly, all of these women met with extremely violent ends. Most were burned alive, burned at the stake, we call that. The women in my book, though, accepted full consequences of their actions after their trials. Rose Butler's last words before she was executed in Washington Square Park in New York City were, "I am satisfied to the justness of my fate. It is all right." At her execution in Galveston, Texas in 1858, Lucy spoke for the last time. She had not really spoken much. She used silence as a form of resistance in her trial, but she spoke this one last time, expressing a perfect willingness to die and hope for forgiveness in the next life. In antebellum Virginia, R.G. Davis told the court that when he told the 60-year-old Nellie that she better be prepared to meet her God, she replied that she was all right on that question. Annis, though, had a different tone in colonial North Carolina. She vowed to follow her owner into the afterlife and kill him again. The fact that these women persisted in their plans to decide a certain death, so they knew what the consequences were, demonstrates that they were willing to die pursuing their version of justice. In conclusion, motivated to lethal resistance by different things than enslaved men, women didn't always strive to destroy slavery or the power structure. Instead, they were motivated to destroy the unjust person in power. Only then did they find a measure of justice and freedom. Thank you. And I want to thank all of my best friend came. She's from Philadelphia. Stacia, wave your hand. And my little sister, Kelly, came in late, but she's here too from Cincinnati. So I guess now it's time for Q&A. Yes. So if you could come up to the mic right here and ask your question. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nathan Weisler, and I'm a 2021 graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington D.C. area, and I'm reading your book with great interest and noted the reference to the book Celia a Slave at the beginning of the book. I read the book Celia a Slave at Montgomery College.
Excellent.
And thank you. And I also learned about Margaret Garner also during my time at Montgomery College. I was wondering if you would be able to speak some about Margaret Garner.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. What's your name again?
Nathan Weisler.
Nathan Weisler has asked me about my third book, the topic, Margaret Garner. And this enslaved woman had a different approach to resistance. She killed her children, or at least one of her children, and tried to kill all the others, who by many accounts may have been the children of her enslaver. And so that's one of the reasons I felt compelled to write this book. I was doing a lecture, and somebody in the audience said, well, why did she kill her children and not the slave owner? I said, good question. So here's the answer. This is the opposite end of that. But yeah, that happened in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1850s, and it became a pretty national case that centered on whether or not she should be charged with murder in Ohio, which all the abolitionists wanted her charged with murder because that meant she would be separated from slavery. And then the Kentuckians, which is where she was from, decided that she should just be remanded back to slavery. So Kentucky won. She was remanded back to slavery. And then her owner did some subterfuge to try to keep her from the courts another time. And another baby ended up drowning in the Ohio River. So it's one of the most heartbreaking cases. But yeah, that is yet another example. You guys are like, what's wrong with this? This professor is nuts. But I like stories like this because of the challenges with the archive and the legal cases. And it's about my favorite thing, which is slave resistance. So thank you for mentioning that. That's a plug for my third book. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Go ahead, dear.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Taylor.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm excited to read the book. So I wrote down my question. Okay, so like you, I'm interested in exploring the lives and experiences of enslaved women and girls in the U.S., and often we encounter gut-wrenching stories and sometimes traumatic events, and I just wanted to know, how are you able to read through numerous stories, which can be triggering, and how do you take care of yourself when doing so?
Oh, I love that question. This is one of my dissertation students, Fatima. Say hi,
Hi,
Fatima. And she's sharp
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not good at that, and they cause migraines. I have a lot of health. There is always a consequence for working with the graveyard of archival sources. This is not easy work, which is why maybe most people like to read and write about happy things that uplift them. But this is very necessary, especially because I'm challenging certain long-standing assumptions about slavery and enslaved women. But you just have to take time away from it, push back away from it from time to time. And you have to really practice like balancing it with other stories.
Okay.
Right? And so you can't just always be like the Margaret Garner book. like I hated her when I was writing it because I'm a mother.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is wrong with this chick? This is my thoughts as I'm writing. Very unprofessional. But like, you killed your child. But when I was writing the acknowledgments is when I finally realized why she did it. And I was writing the acknowledgments to my daughter, and I said, you know, your life is so pregnant with possibilities. Like, oh my God, that's why she did it. Her children had no future in slavery. And it didn't hit me. So then I had to go back and revise some other stuff. So, but you have to push away from it. You can't do it every day. Right. You have to have things in your life that fill you back up, because it's a depleting type of history. So you have to fill yourself back up. I do comedy on the side. Just kidding. But I am, in my family, I do stand-up comedy. And so, you have to fill yourself back up with things like that. But there are times you can't write a book like this and just research it and do it all at once. It can take years. Because I can put this stuff away for 6 months at a time because it's so depressing. And so, so we can talk at Howard about, you know, how to keep your mind in the right place. Thank you so much. It's a great question. Thank you, Fatima.
My question kind of dovetails with the discussion we're having with Nathan's question. Some of the current crop of book burners seem to be very excised about Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which, as I understand it, concerns an enslaved woman who kills her child.
No, you're thinking of Beloved.
Okay. Did that discussion enter into your process while you were writing this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So not this book, but the third book.
Okay.
I should have done a book talk on Driven Towards Madness. But the third book, yes, it was because I wanted to write the real history of the Beloved story. So I wrote the real history of the Beloved story. So what a lot of English teachers tell me is they use both in the class, well, before all of the banning. They use both in the classroom together. And because there's some themes that are consistent in both the fiction and in my historical book. And that common theme is the trauma and the unprocessed trauma that enslaved women had to deal with. And so I think that's why those two can work together in the classroom. But that's a great question.
And you can write true crime in the same process.
Yeah, it pays more than history books. That's next career. Hi, Stacia.
Hi, Dr. Taylor. How are you?
Good.
Would you consider these iconic women in your current book predecessors of the Me Too movement?
I consider them, yes. Thank you. I consider them predecessors of a long history of Black women who have fought back against enslavers. For example, Centoya Brown Long, you all know that story, who in, I think, 2006 was convicted for murdering her enslaver. And she spent like 13, 15 years in prison for that until she finally got clemency in 2019. There's another young woman by the name of Crystal Kaiser, and I think Kenosha, Wisconsin. She and her enslaver was a white man, and she was trafficked by him. And she drove to his house, killed him, stole his BMW, and just all these things that my women are doing in an earlier moment. And when they asked her why she did it, she said, basically, he's not a good man, and I'm freeing all the young women that he has corrupted. So she saw herself as a savior of sorts, but also a purveyor of justice, right? And so, and then ironically, to all of you, like her case was remarkably similar to the judicial obstacles that the women in my book had to encounter. So with with Crystal Kaiser, the judge would not let her do an affirmative defense. Affirmative defense means that you're basically saying that I did it in self-defense. And when you claim affirmative defense, it allows the defense then to bring in the past history of her enslaver, who was not only a trafficker and enslaver, he was a child predator. But the judge was like, no, Crystal Kaiser's attorneys fought all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to get her a basic right that other people have, that white female defendants have. They can claim self-defense in a case like that. And so she finally won, but it's just such a miscarriage of justice. And you start to wonder, there just definitely shows that there are parallel judicial systems. I won't call them justice systems, but judicial systems. And Black women are just crushed, both historically and presently, especially when they're trying to fight against trafficking and things like that, to this extent. So thank you for that.
Hi. Thanks so much for that talk. I was
you.
very struck by your observation that a lot of the motivation for these women was very much related to their individual circumstances rather than the broader sort of political concept of the institution of slavery. And I was wondering if you could go into some of the reasons that, to your understanding, that might be, and the sort of views that enslaved people had on the overall institution, separate from their individual circumstances.
Yeah, that's a great question. What's your name again?
Samuel.
Samuel. So Samuel, I think it's important that we as scholars understand that all the enslaved people were not men, and they didn't all have the same concerns. And so this was very important for me as a Black female writing this history about Black women to state that they had different concerns. Like when we are talking about the history of running away, for example, we know that men tended to run away more often than the enslaved women. It's not that enslaved women didn't want to run away, but they were tied by family and children, and then sometimes their geographies of containment, this is a concept another scholars come up with, kind of kept them trapped in the house where all the eyes were. So they didn't have the freedom to be out in the field where they could like easily slip away. And so all of these things, both that, the instance of running away and how it's different between men and women, suggest that we have to look at slavery perhaps through this gendered lens. And it's not always through house slave versus field slave, which are the traditional ways that we look at slavery, but maybe there are different gendered experiences. And Deborah Great White said that years ago, but sometimes we just forget it when we're doing history. And so, yeah, I was surprised. I said, oh my God, I just knew they were going to be like, oh, we're tired of slavery. And they were maybe on some level, but they were tired of the unjust people in their lives more so. And so maybe that's what they felt they had power to control. And so, you know, and I can't really, you know, because we don't have enough evidence for me to speculate too much about, you know, more than what I told you, because the mindsets are, you know, psychology or some other realm, not history. But yeah, something that needs further exploration and complication in terms of how historians have approached it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Samuel.
You had mentioned that slaves weren't allowed to testify. If you were the person accused of murder, were you precluded from testifying? Was your lawyer the person who testified for you, and did that lawyer have to be white?
I love that question. So, oddly enough, nobody was allowed to testify in their own defense, even white people. So there's that. But specifically, Black people were not allowed to testify against white people. And sometimes enslaved people were not allowed to testify at all, right? But sometimes they allowed them. It just depended, because again, they're in different courts than white defendants. They're in slave courts with a slave owner as a judge, a white male slave owning jury. So it's a different judicial system for them at the time. And so basically, you know, our ideas about the justice system and our rights, which, you know, were kind of started through the Magna Carta way back in the 15th century. But there are things that we expect now, like they didn't read us our Miranda rights. All of these things are modern and recent interventions, even the right to testify in your own case. And so that's just really, unfortunately, what the case was at the time. If you were accused of murder, you couldn't testify, white or Black, but the Black people who were being accused couldn't even bring in their free Black friends to say, oh, Nikki was at my house all night. We stole some liquor and that's what we were doing. Like they couldn't do it. And then that caveat, like I told you in Cicely's case, where you can have your ears pinned to a pillory and cut off. I'm sorry. You're a friend and all, but yeah, I don't think so, right? And so it's all of these deterrents that just made it. So what happened, sometimes white people, the privileged, like the white people who might have, known the enslaved people, could testify and provide witness for a defense. But in most of these cases, in Cicely's case, I think 3 white people testified for her. And they were just testifying about, oh yeah, I don't think the footprints matched. But not anything that really would, render the case like in her favor. And so that was the case. And sometimes if the enslaved person killed somebody other than the owner, the enslaver could come in and testify. Oh yeah, no, I know Nikki. This is not, she didn't do this. So that's the only way they could get off, is if their own owner, came in and testified. But if they were dead, then yeah, there's that. So it's all of these caveats and complications, and yeah. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, so first, thank you for using your microphone to amplify the voices of these Black women.
Thank you.
So in the book you write, local authorities suppress news stories about the incidents because publicizing such crimes could seriously threaten the social, racial, and gender order. So in your opinion, when you think about today's news media, do you think some of that is still going on, the suppression of stories as it relates to Black missing women and children?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was suppressed for different reasons, right? Now I guess they could say, oh, that's not of interest. But back then they suppressed those stories because they didn't want other Black people to think, oh, Nikki and Janelle just killed their owner. Maybe we should do the same to ours, right? And so that's one of the reasons why they kept all of that hush-hush. And it just makes it so difficult for us to find those cases. But yeah, media is problematic across time and space as it relates to Black women, but for different reasons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
What are some of the challenges that you face unearthing some of these records?
This goes back to Fatima's question, just the depressing nature of that kind of research. I also always, when you're doing enslaved history, some of the archivists can be a problem. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. Yeah. Elaborate. Who is that back there? The archivists, they're not always, in any of my books, I've had problems with archivists who lord over certain documents in ways that are just troubling. And so people don't necessarily talk about the problems that Black historians have in the archive, but it is a thing. And as you get older, I've been able to navigate it a little better. But Kentucky, I start the book with a story about Kentucky. I'm from Ohio. I was like, oh, Kentucky is there. They're going to be open. And they were so difficult. They were so difficult. I said, I know this is there. This is what I'm trying to tell you. And it got into a little argument. And I said, what in the world is going on? And so I don't know, because I can't read the minds of and not all archivists, but just the ones who have decided to own certain histories and own the narrative. And so that's why it's important to have more Black archivists in these places, that's very important, people who are more open and receptive. And so, we all go through that. We don't like to talk about it, but it's been a problem my whole career. Hi, Clifford.
How are you, Dr. Taylor?
Hi, another one of my doctoral students.
How's it going?
Good. Good to see you. Yeah.
Likewise. I think you just answered my question, but well, firstly, I want to say thank you for putting this talk on. Congratulations on your book and everything that you do for the program and the discipline. I was going to ask about, the coloniality of the archives and how, some scholars talk about the silence that's reproduced in the archives as a product of the silence that enslaved people faced
Yeah.
within the institution. How did you navigate that challenge? You kind of answered it, but did you find yourself, how did you create alternative ways of capturing the voices and the stories? And reading against the grain in that silence. In the archive.
And you know, we talk about this in class. Many of you are like, what's reading against the grain? But there are just ways that you have to approach a historical record when you're trying to amplify the voices of disempowered people. And so, you know, all of these things that Cicely was saying and doing, her actions matter, whereas mostly historians are not necessarily concerned with little gestures or, you know, irreverent speak, like, because Rose Butler was cursing out ministers and doing all of that in jail. And I was like, oh, this is tasty, because it's more evidence of her resistance and the nature of who she was. And so the actions, the things left unsaid in the last chapter, the woman used silence as resistance. And so when somebody uses silence as resistance, then that means their words are not in the archive. But I understood what she was doing. And I understood that she defied the whiteness of that courtroom that dared to render her, you know, as other. And when they asked her questions, she didn't say anything. She got outside the courtroom, saw a reporter, let me tell you what else. And I'm like, so it's like that, you have to look at all of that. And you can't just say, oh, well, this is the end of the story. She never said anything in court, so therefore, yeah, that's the end of the story. So finding that whole story, looking at the gestures, the silences matter, all of that is how you do these types of histories where you can amplify these voices. And for me, these last two books, Black Feminist Theory has done wonders. Because like I said in the talk, Black Feminist Theory pushes against this idea that Black women are just invisible, worthless, and it fights and combats stereotypes. It was particularly important for me because my daughter said to me, she's so bad. She said, she's 27. She said, Mom, this is just a lot of angry Black women, isn't it? I said, okay, listen here, okay? So I had her words, and I had to like write around the naysayers who might be in the room, like you guys, and say, this is just, you're doing a disservice to Black women. You're painting us as angry Black women. So Black Feminist Theory like rights that wrong. And how I approached it rights that wrong. You can't no longer say that they're impulsive because they are planning, okay? You can no longer say that they're just enraged. They're telling you why they did this, okay? You can't say that they're disorganized, okay? You can't just say that they're just like bloodthirsty. They're like, look, listen, you heard what Chloe said and why she did what she did. So all of that is important when you're doing histories of people who don't read and write, and the archive doesn't do them any favors. People are not recording their testimony. I was so upset when Cicely, all the indecent things, I was like, no, I need those indecent things. What are they? We don't know, but we know what Victorian era society was like. So we can only imagine what the indecent things Dr. Longan had done to her. We can imagine, like those of us who know, we know. And so all of that allowed flesh to be wrapped around the stuff in the SB database. So I wrapped flesh around the database stuff. I wrapped flesh around the numbers. I gave voice to people who would have been rendered invisible. Up till now, nobody's brought these women to the scene in the way that I did. So that's why I think it's important you have to think very carefully before you write a book. You have to plan it. You have to think about the naysayers, because that helps you become a stronger historian. Like, so my daughter, sadly, she did help me. Because if she hadn't said that little snarky thing, then I wouldn't have thought about it. I would have just said, of course they're not angry Black women, right? But that is a question that people who are outside the discipline may think. So I had to address it. Thank you, Clifford. Is that all the questions? Wow, you guys are pretty. Okay, go ahead, Nikki.
Oh, no, I'm here to wrap things up if you're done. Okay. So sorry.
No other questions?
I mean, actually, now that I'm here, I do. So I'm in the process of thesis writing. What's your best writing habit? How do you get a book finished?
Yeah, well, that is, I wrote 2 books as an administrator. So I'm trying to remember back to when I wasn't an administrator. I have a schedule. My students know. Can you reach me on Fridays, you guys? No. Never. I'm not going to respond. Fridays are my research days, my writing days. That's my day. Saturday, Sunday, they can email me, oh, Dr. Taylor, Saturday at midnight. I'm like, yeah. Did you get my email? Because it came in as Saturday. And so you have to set boundaries, Nikki, like very clear boundaries. Like, because you obviously have a job too. Maybe you have a family. So you have to have boundaries, and your family has to know what it is. Like, stop by. My daughter calls me. She lives in Ohio now. Calls me all the time. Stop bothering me, right? Because I have to. She's 27. I'm not abusive, by the way. But yeah, I have to get my work done. And so they understand that there's just things I have to do. But again, my own delays were because, this is heavy. I got to put this aside, and I'm gonna go ride a bike or go walking or do whatever you enjoy, and then come back to this in a few months. So just be very intentional about your research days and your writing days, and don't let anybody disrupt those. So that's the best advice.
I think we've got time for one more.
Kari. Hi.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for this
wonderful.
Thanks
for coming.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the this wonderful evening. I had a question in regards to the process that you were undergoing, researching, composing this book. Okay. Could you speak to, I think you've already kind of touched upon it, but the weight, that was involved, reaching kind of back into the past to kind of grab and pull these women into our present, right?
Yeah.
But also the potential sense of liberation that you felt for yourself or those women.
That's good. Let me tell you guys, if you didn't know, these Howard students, exceptional. Like, I've never been challenged the way I have since coming to Howard. Thank you, he's an undergraduate, by the way, very sharp young man. So yeah, the weight I kind of talked about, but the thing that gave me a little bit of light is the fact that 100% of these women were successful in their intended act. Unlike a lot of the revolts planned by the men. I said, okay. So they did everything that they were supposed to do. Levity is important to me, as you can see. I'm a little silly. I think I'm a comedian on the side. That's important. So the book, even though it's a heavy topic, Kelly, would you say it'll make you laugh? And you feel guilty laughing? Because you're like, am I laughing about murder? This is... Ugh. But levity was important for me to include in the text. And how I write about some of the women. I mean, yeah, they just are very similar to people I know, right? Some of them in the room, people like Stacia there with the orange hair. These are like my sisters, people that I know are defiant and resistors. And so that was something that gave me a little bit of peace, that fire of resistance has been there all along. It's been there all along, regardless of whether or not you think this was the wrong kind of resistance or not. We have been resisting from the beginning in thundertones. And just because it looks like we didn't say anything about it, because people are not looking at the criminal records and the trial records, we were talking a lot of mess back then too, just like we do today, black women. So that kind of was comforting to know that we are not that dissimilar from our enslaved sisters from these other eras. So thank you. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for this incredible talk.